Alrighty, impromptu stream time. I don't know. Sometimes the the spirit just comes over me, and I want to set up something incredibly off the cuff. Because why not? I mean, we're all
Right.
sitting around. We're not quite on heavy lockdown anymore, but it's not as though cool parties and such are just easily available on a Friday night. You're apparently home, not going to any cool parties, as am I. So,
Yeah. That's not really a change, though.
oh well, yeah, not for me either. I mean, I would maybe go to like maybe one or two cool parties a year.
Yeah.
But now it's just zero, which is kind of good because you have a built-in excuse. Like, I don't want the virus.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
That's
although the infection rate, because I was the last time we did a chat, I was in the midst of my travels, so I was in Minneapolis
yeah.
at the time. But I'm back home now in Jersey City, and the infection rate just reached a new low in the area yesterday. So I don't know how tenable that excuse is going to be, at least around here, for much longer. So we got to savor every last bit of it.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So I mean, the very vague impetus for this is like, what's the deal with Zoomers? Because and we kind of talked a little bit about that tangentially in our last discussion. But I'm sort of thinking about it in a variety of different contexts right now, because we just finished the Democratic convention, unconventional convention.
Yeah.
And I don't know, did you happen to watch Biden's speech by any chance?
I caught some clips of it.
Okay.
I didn't really watch any of the convention stuff. I just saw stuff that floated across my timeline and a couple things on YouTube. I think I saw part of it, yeah. But I saw a lot more clips of the just like random panels, the crazy nonsense panels that they were having.
Yeah, they like Tucker did a segment I think on Thursday or Wednesday night, where he had his people just watch these much lesser known convention segments that happened during the day. And there were some interesting. Did you see that?
They were bad. I did.
Where there was a guy who, or I shouldn't say guy. There was a person who self-identified like as a pansexual mermaid or something. Did you see that?
I did.
What's okay? Anyway, we can get into that, I guess. But the point in terms of the generational thing, in watching Biden's speech, it was pretty clear to me that it was tailored. If it was tailored toward a particular age group, it was older people. It was like senior citizens, right? Because we see now a trend in the polling where voters 65 and over are shifting pretty dramatically, almost amazingly, to the Democratic candidate compared to 2016. And if Biden just maintains the lead he apparently has with voters in that age bracket, the election is essentially over. I'm not declaring it over, but I'm saying if that's what the margin ends up being in by November, then it's essentially over. Because it would be almost, I don't know if it's unprecedented, but it's definitely a dramatic shift that people hadn't anticipated. The tenor or the tone of the speech seemed to be very much framed with them in mind. I mean, it was sort of a national unity type speech, so theoretically anybody of any age group could have found it compelling, but like it's not the speech that like an AOC would have delivered, let's say, in prime time. And we do now see that there's deflated or depressed enthusiasm toward Biden individually amongst younger voters, and so I mean all that is just a long-winded way of leading up to sort of can we generalize much at all about the political attitudes of Zoomers? Do we focus too much on these sort of outlandish identity preoccupations that I guess they're somewhat associated with. No, how are you sort of thinking about that right now? You know what
I
I mean?
wouldn't say we're, yeah, I wouldn't say we're over focusing on it. I think the focus that we're giving it is necessary, just because I feel like for people in my generation, if you've gone to college, it's very likely that you've been exposed to a lot of these like very radical and flawed ideas. But I do think that it is a little bit, it's hard to generalize, because people ask me sometimes, like, are Zoomers more conservative or are Zoomers more social justice warriors? And it's like, you can't really say that for everyone, because yes, the people who go to college are likely to kind of get roped into the social justice stuff, and especially like women and more alternative women who use the internet a lot more, they're really likely to go that direction. But I also think there's a lot of people in this age bracket that are either apolitical or more conservative. So it's not fair to generalize, but it's also important to look at the trend.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you know, there's always been it's always been a little silly to excessively generalize along generational lines. I mean, it just lends itself to easy media tropes and, Time magazine cover stories and things. So it's kind of just a construct that people use to oversimplify trends. But there is, like, and we talked about this in our previous discussion, there is a very discernible, at least to me, distinction between people in my general age bracket, which is not that far removed from the Zoomers. I mean, I'm, I guess, a younger millennial. In terms of what the overriding issue preoccupations are, maybe it has something to do with the fact that, like, my people who were born, like, let's say within 4 years of me, so 1988. So I don't know. Let's say 84 to 92 or something. We sort of came of age under George W. Bush. And so my political development, to the extent that you could say that like a 15-year-old or something has a political development, was informed by Bush as the main wielder of political power in the country, right? And you had the conservative, the religious, the Christian right was seen as ascendant at that time, or at least they were in like the popular imagination. Gay marriage was a big topic, and gay marriage just seemed so obvious, like it wasn't, and yet it was controversial because there was some serious resistance to it. And then gay marriage was like achieved. Then people who came of age under late Obama or Trump, it's just sort of a different set of conditions that you're, marinating under. It's like with gay marriage achieved, if you're still involved in, like, let's say LGBT politics, and you pursue that as your primary mode of expression, then you have to just get increasingly radical, because gay marriage, it's not like you could just declare victory on gay marriage and then move on. You weren't really involved in the gay marriage struggle. You were just too young, or, you weren't around. Yeah. So there has to be something else for you to seek out. And that's, I think, sort of the impulse maybe in why the gender binary became so elevated in terms of its prominence for people of that cohort, or the more kind of intense aspects of the trans ideology in particular. And so, yeah, I'm just sort of riffing here, but that's sort of how I tentatively see maybe something that's behind this sort of dynamic.
I definitely think that is a part of it. But I think another aspect that has resulted in the shift to more radical LGBT views and theory, and like all this gender stuff in general, is that in the more radical, like, queer circles, gay marriage is not really seen as a very important thing. It's not really seen as something that, like the main LGBT thing that we should aspire to. In a lot of circles, it's actually seen as not the best practice for liberating LGBT people, because it's kind of like trying to assimilate LGBT people into heteronormative society. And like, I know like not everyone believes that outright, but that is very much a prevailing attitude that influences people to, at least now that gay marriage is over with, to focus on a different approach to LGBT issues.
Yeah, and there was always a debate within LGBT or queer circles in terms of how gay marriage was fundamentally like a heteronormative construct, and therefore wasn't the pinnacle of liberation for people whose very identity counterposed them to the heteronormative construct. And so, gay conservatives were really a driving force in mainstreaming gay marriage as a signature policy issue for that, for bringing gays and lesbians into the societal fold so they could have access to all the institutional resources that straight couples did. So, for example, Andrew Sullivan, he wrote a book called, I think it was Perfectly Normal, making a conservative, essentially, case for gay marriage very early on. The idea was, with that institution available to gays, they then won't be it then won't be automatic for them to go into this more queer radical politics. And I don't know if it really worked out that way. I mean, maybe it did around them, but in terms of what we see, maybe it didn't. But then again, maybe there are gays who just are now in a normal, relatively speaking, lifestyle, married, and less inclined to go into these sort of societal subgroups that are more radically tinged. But maybe we just have more self-identifying LGBT people overall. I don't know. It's sort of interesting to parse out,
I think that like it might be kind of a result of, so like when you said the conservative case for gay marriage, it kind of made me think of like conservatives making a concession with the radicals that like, okay, we're going to meet in the middle and support gay marriage. But then once, that passed successfully, the radicals are still there. They didn't go away. And just because you kind of compromise with them in a way, that doesn't change their worldview being completely antithetical to what yours is and to what a lot of mainstream society is. So by virtue of, making gay marriage the mainstream issue that kind of everyone could agree on, which I agree with, at the same time, it did kind of ignore that problem of the radicals.
Yeah. And you wrote a piece that I read at, what was the website called? The Discourses, is that right?
New Discourses.
Mm-hmm. Where you sort of got to the ideological underpinnings of some of this. And the New Discourse is this it's like sort of a resource for people who just are trying to understand what critical theory is. They just need somebody to just explain it to them, in plain English, although it does get a little bit, there's a little bit of an academic jargon to it. That could be sort of mystifying, I think, to the average person in a way, but it is useful if you're not familiar with the literature, let's say. So why did you write that piece in particular? Why did you feel that was needed at the moment? I know we'll link to it in the description box.
Yeah. So I just got really upset. I saw the study in the piece I referenced. There's a study about, I believe it's, their way of saying it is mental health outcomes after gender transition surgeries. And they measured this by seeing, before and after surgery, how much mental health care do people in Sweden seek out. And they found that on average, there was a decrease in 8% of mental health care visits, therapy, psychiatry, hospitalizations per year since the last surgery. And I was aware of this study, and I was aware of a lot of the criticisms of this study. But eventually, those criticisms were brought to light, and the journal that published the study, I think it issued a retraction or something, or no, it issued a correction, because the original authors of the study went back referencing some of the criticisms and found that actually when you look at the data in an unbiased way, it doesn't really show that much of an impact on the general well-being and mental health of the people who get the surgeries. And so I read that thread about the study, and I thought back to when I had seen those criticisms about the study before, and it just felt like just another example of ideological people under the cloak of major educational institutions and their own degrees passing their ideology through as science when it's really not science. They didn't use a control group. They didn't really use any kind of scientific methods with their data. And then when you did, you find that there's not really that decrease in mental health outreach that they were saying was proved by their study. So I was just like, I was fuming about it, because it just makes me so upset to know that people are being fooled. Because that study was done at Yale. So you see a study saying surgery saves lives by Yale. The average person is going to see that and think that that's credible, but it's often not anymore. So that's why I wrote it.
Yeah, it's interesting because, especially when you're talking about LGBTQ, the Q part, queer, it's an inherently political notion, right?
Yeah.
Queer connotes a rejection of the standard social order, right? And that has obvious political implications, and yet it gets presented apolitically, as if it's just open to typical scientific inquiry, that is impartial, you know. And I think that there's an element of that in terms of how it relates to gender non-binary or / trans ideology that gets obscured. Like I often, if I mention trans ideology, people bristle automatically. They think that that's something that's almost a slur or it's derogatory to suggest that it has any ideological connotations, right? But from what I gather, in terms of how people discuss it, it's inherently ideological. I mean, it's almost in a way like transitioning or not can be an ideological decision. I mean, there are people who are pretty overt in saying, I've seen that they had an ideological part of what drove them to decide to transition was ideological or political. I mean, there was an amazing.
I did.
Right, exactly. But and you're not the only one. And then there was an amazing first person essay that somebody sent me in Vox. I don't know if you saw this, where
No,
this
I haven't.
person formerly the name of this person formerly Todd Vanderwerf, who I read occasionally because he at the time was writing reviews of Sopranos episodes. And when I rewatched The Sopranos for the first time, at the I would just go and read his recaps, and then all of a sudden now she is Emily Vanderwerf, and you can go and she writes for Vox, or she's some kind of correspondent for Vox, and she wrote an essay. And when somebody described it to me ahead of time, I almost didn't believe it. I had to go read it for myself. And she's saying that she transitioned in part because of watching the show A Handmaid's Tale and the significance that had in Trump's America. Like she was saying that there was a I'll send this to you. I mean, you got to read it.
Yeah, Jesus.
But I mean, but there are so if political factors can at least be a partial reason why you would choose to undertake a transition, then there's a political dimension here, obviously and straightforwardly, and yet just mentioning that gets people really angry, I find. I mean, they don't want to acknowledge there's any ideological component at all. And that's actually effective in mainstreaming their belief system. If you can just portray it as totally apolitical, totally shorn of any ideological implications whatsoever, then that's an effective strategy to bring your ideology to the fore in a way that doesn't make people just doesn't think that dissuades anybody from thinking about it through a political prism.
Yeah, and I think that's part of why this like kind of fake science that they do is so important, because it legitimizes it. But I don't think like the end goal of a lot of like the hardcore theorists is to completely separate the act of transitioning from a medical procedure for gender dysphoria. So it's very complicated. There's just like there's so much stuff going on in this broader worldview that encompasses queer and trans that there's just so many contradictions within it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just gonna pull up this. Okay, so here's the. I don't know if you can see that.
Okay.
I think they might have changed the title, but yeah, it was The Handmaid's Tale. Anyway.
Also, people get so angry because it's literally like, it's so obvious. It's so obvious that it's ideological. Like nothing just comes out of nowhere over the course of like 3 to 5 years and just completely takes over the culture like trans stuff has, without it being somewhat political or ideological. In this case, it's very overtly political and ideological, and I think anyone can sense that. But since there's so much emotional manipulation of the average person coming from inside the ideology, it's really hard for people to contend with that, because they're like, they've been told that if you question anything at all, you're transphobic, and transphobia kills people, and you're going to cause people to get killed and kill themselves and all this kind of stuff. Like the kind of the supreme victimhood status that trans people have been put on, that pedestal. I think a lot of people, like, they can't even allow themselves to acknowledge what is blatantly obvious, and that's why they get so upset.
Yeah, so it sort of reminds me of how Black Lives Matter gets discussed at times. Like,
Yes,
they'll say that it's
same
not,
thing.
it's a human rights issue. It's not a political issue. I mean, that's why so many corporations were comfortable proclaiming their support for it, immediately putting up your Instagram posts and their tweets, you know, saying how committed they were to Black Lives Matter. And, you know, Black Lives Matter can mean different things to different people, but it's bizarre to deny that there's no political demands associated with it. If they're making, if they're calling for policy changes, you know, and they have, you know, different people associated with the movement, we're going to call for different things policy-wise, right? But there are pretty clearly policy demands associated with it, right? So, and that's the definition of politics. I mean, if you're trying to change how society is ordered through the through political organizing or what have you, that's just straight up politics. And yet to call it political is deemed offensive in some quarters, even though you have, like, Black Lives Matter was the main theme of the Democratic National Convention. It's a major political party, right? I mean, Kamala Harris declared Black Lives Matter. I think she used the exact phrase in her acceptance speech. So yeah, it's just this weird tension that, you know, again, the best thing you can do if you want your political agenda to have the widest possible purchase is to say it's not political.
Yeah.
And you see this, like, even sometimes you see this at funerals, like when John McCain died, people were saying, "Oh, this isn't political. It's just the commemoration of a death." And you have all sorts of political people showing up, making overtly political statements that aren't cast in typical partisan terms, but nonetheless have major political salience in terms of what they're prescribing for how society is structured, right? And that's just a tried and true strategy. Just think, this is not political, but when it is,
it's just so especially crazy with Black Lives Matter, because I kind of get it with trans stuff, even though I obviously don't agree. I think it's very political and very ideological, but there's a way to kind of frame it where I can see someone convincing themselves that it's not political at all. But with the Black Lives Matter stuff, especially this most recent situation with George Floyd, like, I just don't understand how you can look at some of the stuff that's gone down and say it's not political. They gave him a folded flag, and all the Democrats were kneeling on the floor of the building that they're in. I don't know what it's called.
Yeah,
but it's like all of these kind of like very performative. Yeah. All these like very performative things done by politicians in the name of politics. So it's like, how can you deny that it's political when they literally gave him a folded flag? Like, how?
Yeah, and you have, why would politicians be so forceful in declaring their solidarity with a movement if it had no political implications? Right? Yeah, they're politicians. Exactly. They're very cognizant of public opinion and how they can marshal trends in public opinion to retain power and to achieve additional power. I mean, that's the whole purpose of political life, right? But
protesting in and of itself is political.
Sure. So establishing the political nature of all this, it's weird that you constantly run into this wall of people denying there's a political element here. Especially on trans stuff. I mean, if you accept all the premises associated with the rejection of the gender binary and such, it has obvious implications for law, for culture, for any number of domains that dictate how we operate collectively as a society. So I would almost if those are your beliefs, fine, but just be honest about what you're advocating,
It's cliche because everyone says it, but like, this is obviously so religious in nature, and it almost makes me think like it's almost as if we lived in a theocratic country, and the fact that religion was going to be put into law and constantly a part of the legal system and the political system is almost taken for granted. And I think that's kind of done with social justice and Black Lives Matter and trans as well, like all of that stuff, because people see it in such like a religious way and they connect to it in such a religious way that it's the fact that it's in politics and in law and so deeply entrenched in our culture, that's just understood to be the way it is, and it doesn't seem abnormal that it would be, or disingenuously political that it would be pushed in these political situations like it is. I think it has something to do with that.
Yeah, I don't think it, I mean, maybe it is a cliche because a lot of people are bringing up that metaphor now in terms of how the protest movement has turned out and the anti-racism ideology that is so popular at the moment and the religious elements thereof. But there's a reason why religion is such a constant throughout human history. It's because it can take on so many different manifestations. And for secular people, meaning or at least those who don't necessarily affirm belief in an omniscient, omnipresent, monotheistic God, to then believe yourself to be immune from the religious impulse, which is obviously fundamental to human nature in some sense, is arrogant. But it's interesting that people sort of take that as an insult if you accuse them of having a religious fervor. I mean, religious fervor works. I mean, lots of people are religious, and it obviously animates some kind of yearning within them. So I don't see why people should take offense to that. I mean, if your zeal is so stringent, then why shouldn't it take on a religious character?
I think because to describe it as religious, you're kind of implying that you are an outsider looking in, like looking at this movement, and you're analyzing it, and you're deciding that it has these religious qualities to it, when the people who actually believe it, they don't think of it that way. They just think of it as the truth. Like they don't even, like, they haven't reached that level. Like they're not on the level of someone who can stand outside of it and look in on it and see that it's religious.
Yeah, I mean, you almost have to be told from the outside that what you're subscribing to is a sort of religious doctrine. Like, did the early Christians in ancient Palestine think of themselves as religious?
Right.
Probably not. I mean, that was something that was sort of theorized about them later, which is what they were. So you need people who at least strive to have some degree of objectivity in analyzing what their belief system is in order to make the inference that it constitutes religion in some form. Like even those who, even civil religion, right? That concept was a sociological one that people like Robert Bellah came up with in the mid 20th century to describe phenomena that had been obviously around for a long time, but hadn't been analyzed in quite that fashion before. So you need people who are on the outside to almost tell the believers what it is that they're putting forth as a belief system.
Too bad they won't listen.
They don't. So you've got? I feel like you've probably gotten. How has it been over the past month or two for you? Because I think more people are probably aware of you now, and you're talking to more people and getting out there. What's the reception been like? Are you making inroads, you feel, or?
Yeah, a little bit here and there. I'm definitely working on some of my own stuff. Like a friend and I are gonna start a podcast. It's gonna be kind of an interesting format. So it's gonna be like me and her as the two hosts, and then we're gonna have anywhere from like 3 to 5 guests each week to like tackle one broader topic, and to bring people that are kind of from different not opposing sides, but just like different perspectives on the issues that we're discussing. So that's going to be very fun. And then I'm also finally going to start a YouTube channel. So I've got some like stuff in the mix. As for just like my reception on Twitter, it's the same as it always has been. I've changed a little bit, so I feel a lot more able to speak my mind now than I did 2 or 3 months ago even. So that's nice. And there's definitely more people that I've connected with that are supportive of kind of like the place I'm in terms of how I look at things and how I think of things. But there's always going to be those people who admire me and tell me good things, and then there's also the people who don't. So
that is true.
I'm still kind of trying to figure out what's going on. Yeah, I know.
What happened exactly with the detrans subreddit? Because was it banned for like an hour or something at one point, and they came back? Like, what happened exactly? Because you're a mod there, right?
Yeah, I am, but I'm not active. I stopped being an active mod maybe like a year to a year and a half ago, so I'm not nearly as like in on it. But yeah, so since before the subreddit was even made, there has been a group of, I don't know how you would call it, but influential Reddit users that are trans, who they do not want detransition content on Reddit. So there has been like some of that attitude towards detransitioners on Reddit since before the subreddit was even made. And since it was made, there's been just like kind of a constant effort to paint the subreddit as being hate speech, kind of the typical stuff. And eventually it accumulated into Reddit admin and the moderators of DTrans arguing over how much we're supposed to police the people posting to our subreddit, because we're not supposed to tolerate any transphobic language. But what constitutes transphobic language is the question. And what they consider transphobic language is, in many ways, just people criticizing the trans community and the trans movement and the trans ideology. But yeah, so mods and admin are always fighting and arguing. And then eventually we kind of got to the point where we were like, yeah, we're probably going to get banned soon, especially after Gender Critical was banned and a couple other transphobic subreddits were banned. We were like, okay, we're definitely going to get banned. And then on July 7th, I think it was, somewhere around there.
Sorry to interrupt, but what was the Gender Critical subreddit? I don't remember that, because was that deemed inherently transphobic because it was just critical of sort of feminist ideology and things like that? I guess
it was a radical feminist subreddit.
I guess they think that the mere presence of people expressing these views constitutes harm, right? Or it puts them in danger. Yeah.
That's what they think. And especially with DTrans, they think that we are going to lure trans people in and like convince them to detransition, and then they're going to get confused and kill themselves and all the good stuff. So that's what they think is wrong with DTrans. They also don't think that detransitioners exist in the amounts that are posting to the subreddit. They think that there are like global networks of radical feminists posting to the subreddit pretending to be detransitioners, to get people to think that people are detransitioning.
Like TERFs.
Yeah, exactly. And they legitimately think this stuff.
Is there any possibility that there's some truth to that somewhere? Like, is it feasible that there are people who have that motivation?
I would say there are people who have that motivation, but there's just not the need for them to do that. There's not the need for 15,000 TERFs to go on Reddit and pretend to be detransitioners when there's enough people on there who clearly are. Like, they have months and months of post history going into explicit detail. So it would be one of the biggest cons in all of history if there was thousands and thousands of TERFs writing months of post history, tens of thousands of words to pretend to be detransitioners. And even if there might be motivation, I don't think it's true.
I mean, the odd thing is about the DTrans subreddit, and I scanned it recently for the first time, I think just because you had mentioned it, so I just was curious. And it's very tightly moderated, right? I mean, you can't, normal people, I mean, you have to go through a process to even be able to post. You have to be of a certain like typology, right? I mean, it's not just a public subreddit where it's like a free for all, right? I mean, they very carefully moderate it. So, and they, the rules prohibit any explicitly derogatory content in terms of, demonizing individual people or whatever. And so for even that, I mean, to be deemed as potentially harmful or causing danger to people means that you just can't discuss the subject at all. I mean, if that wouldn't be allowed, right?
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of the end goal, obviously.
Yeah. So it was banned and then came back, or what happened exactly? That because there was what was that, in July or something, or June?
It was like July 7th or something like that. And yeah, it was banned for about an hour. Everybody freaked out for that hour, and then it just randomly came back online. And at first, for like half an hour, you couldn't post to it. It was just online, and it said 0 moderators, so it said that the subreddit was empty, like not being used, not being moderated. But then within like half an hour, the normal stats all came back. And it's actually interesting because, like I mentioned, there's this like group of trans activists who have kind of been targeting the subreddit for years, like over 3 years, which is how old the subreddit is. These are like the same people. So the same people who were doing it back then are the exact same people who I'm about to describe. But while the subreddit was back online without moderators, in that small window of time, one of those trans activists their name on Reddit is Bardfin. It's a MTF, a male to female, who is really, really influential, moderates like over 80 subreddits, and like is friends
What is
with
what is the name again? Sorry.
Bardfin, Bardfin.
I'm gonna look them up.
Yeah, I like this person has so much dirt attached to their name, just in being very dishonest, very obsessive, like abusing their influence.
How do you have time to moderate 80 subreddits?
Right. That's the question.
It's got to be. Yeah. So there's a long history. There's a long history of drama with this person then.
Yes, and this person, during that window when the subreddit said it had 0 moderators, there's a policy on Reddit that if a subreddit is abandoned, you can petition to Reddit to take over that subreddit. And in that little window of time when it said 0 moderators, Bardfin was posting on the subreddit where you petition to take over a sub, and like begging to take over the sub. And that was very strange.
So what
Especially
is your...
because that's how the old detransition subreddit got taken over. So, quick story here. The subreddit before r/detrans was r/detransition, and it was run by a trans woman who was not like mentally detransitioning, like she still considered herself a trans woman, but she regretted her bottom surgery, and so she made the subreddit to post about it. And after, I don't know how long the subreddit was around, but at some point, the founder of that subreddit ended up taking her life. And within mere hours of one of her friends posting to another subreddit that this had happened, that she had passed away, within hours, Bardfin, I can't remember if it was actually Bardfin, but it was this other person, Drewy Poodle, who's like close friends with Bardfin, like they run in the same circles, and 2 other people had taken over the sub. So they used the exact same kind of methods of like, they saw that the moderator was no longer alive and they presented that evidence to Reddit and they were able to take over the subreddit. And then 3 years later, when the new subreddit is banned for an hour, they're like right there immediately trying to do the same thing.
So they're almost launching coup attempts.
Yeah. And like, I don't know if you know anything about Reddit drama. Do you know anything about like subreddit drama, and how subs get banned?
Peripherally. I mean, like I'm a lurker mostly, so I'm not in the weeds. Although
Yeah,
I did do an AMA recently.
Awesome. But in terms of like how you said it's a coup, this is kind of how these activist groups act all over Reddit. Like they will organize things on Discord, like they have their own Discord servers where they talk about taking down subreddits, and they'll make plans of like what to post, when to post, like how to post things in order to get it flagged by the administration and get it taken down. So there's all sorts of tactics that they use to try to either get subreddits banned or take them over. And I think they really want to get detrans taken over as opposed to banned because they want to influence the environment that detransitioners are in. They've even made their own detrans subreddit run by a bunch of trans activists. It's called Our Actual Detrans. Oh. So like they're the actual detransition subreddit, not that one. It's like all sorts of crazy, stupid shenanigans.
I really resent you because now after we finish this like 4 hours on Our Actual Detrans, just sifting through all the drama. So that's probably what the remainder of my night's going to look like. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I, as somebody who sort of spent much of my adolescence on message boards back when that was what people tended to use, there was always such inside baseball drama that was impossible to even explain to the outside world.
Yeah.
Like for example, like these were largely video game message boards, even though that was just sort of people didn't talk about video games all the time. It was just, that was the organizing principle, right? People had to have some basic, I guess, like of video games, right? But you just talk about anything. They're just sort of community boards. And whenever, so obviously it was like 99.9% males.
Mm-hmm.
And then whenever there was a rumor that a female had come, it would be like a 48-hour controversy. Like everybody would be involved in trying to decide, figure out if it was actually like a real girl and a girl IRL. And it's like, you can't really explain that to the outside
Yeah.
world. So yeah, I know I get the drama aspect of it and how you can just get sucked in, and spend all day on it because you do invest a lot of meaning into it if it's something that you really devote your time to.
Oh yeah. That's like my biggest challenge with trying to explain this trans stuff to people. I kind of feel like James Lindsay, where he's always trying to explain like the crazy inner workings of social justice theory. I feel like I'm always trying to explain the crazy inner workings of online communities to people who don't get it. They don't know what it's like to be truly entrenched in all this drama. And it goes beyond drama. It's like it becomes its own like cultural ecosystem. I like to say like, they have their own hierarchy, their own traditions, their own customs, their own languages, their own dialects. Like they have all of this like very unique cultural stuff in these online spaces that it's really hard to just explain to someone what's going on, because it kind of like there's a little bit of a prerequisite to have a basic understanding of the culture before you can even get into the actual events that go down.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, they have their own vocabulary. I mean, so even just if you just want to just explain what people are talking about, you have to like then spend a half hour just laying out the terminology, and that was it's a cultural ecosystem unto itself, and that was definitely the case at these older forums that are kind of obsolete now that I was on. So, but I guess maybe if you have some involvement, maybe in an earlier iteration of insular online communities that have their own set of mores and customs and even language, maybe that works as a prerequisite for like understanding later developments in terms of how online communities organize. So like me trying to explain to somebody who was an adult when I was like 13 was almost impossible. But now a 13-year-old trying to explain it to me might work a little more because at least I have some familiarity with the rough outlines of how that works. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just so different now that I can't relate.
I wonder, like, I actually wonder what it would be like to compare the two, because I really get what you're saying, but there's just something so like mind-blowing about the kind of stuff that goes down on, I'm most familiar with Tumblr, but I've also used Reddit, but like just the kind of stuff that goes down on Tumblr, man, I can't imagine that happening in a video game forum.
Probably not, yeah.
But also maybe it's because it's girls. Maybe that's another thing. Because I've always said, like, what would Lord of the Flies look like if it was girls? And it would be Tumblr.
Oh, so
that's
I mean,
kind of what it's like.
We talked about this last time, so kind of, but like, I don't know. Could you think of an example that is especially mind blowing that you couldn't convey to like an ordinary person? Is there anything that really illustrates that you can think of? Or is it just like a mishmash of stuff that's impossible to like disentangle,
Like the things that I could pull out and like describe to you a specific scenario that's like crazy and it would blow your mind. Like that doesn't communicate the same thing as like the general, like that atmosphere that I'm talking about where people just do and say the most crazy, like far removed from reality things that you can even imagine. It's like, it's so hard to even convey the kinds of things that people argue about on Tumblr, the kinds of things people find important, the things people value, the things people are interested in, the way they think after spending time in these spaces. Like it's completely different than what you encounter anywhere else. So it's hard for me to come up with one example that shows that.
Yeah. But that's why I think you're doing a useful service now, because you're at least attempting to convey it in some fashion, or the beginnings of it, right? Or even if you could just communicate like a vague feeling about it, that's better than nothing, right? So you're performing a useful service for people to sort of understand what is shaping the sentiments and proclivities of people in this age cohort who are now becoming, actual adults and have influence over things and are in the workforce and are in the protest movement, or may even be running for office, So we need to start somewhere.
Yeah, we definitely do. And it kind of does freak me out that, like, okay, so I'm 22 now, and when I was in like these communities on Tumblr, I was between the ages of 14 and 18. And just when I think about those people who were 15 at the same time that I was 15, or maybe people who were 17 when I was 15 and are 2 years older than me, so like they're fully graduated from college, like fully moved into the workforce, I don't think most of them have had kind of the like change in mindset that I have had recently. And I feel like a lot of them went from being crazy on Tumblr to being crazy in art school and then being crazy in the workforce. And so that scares me, especially now that I see a lot of the kinds of things and ideas and just ways of thinking that it's hard to really communicate in examples, but I can recognize it when I see it. Now seeing that reflected in the real world, not just on Tumblr, that's scary.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's difficult to give examples, but can you think of one where maybe that you recognize when you see it, or just like in general terms, like what is it that you recognize when you see it in IRL, or even online? I guess it's not IRL, but like they're all chatting online.
The best way that I can explain it is just like the intersectional worldview where everything is like hierarchies, power, dominance, and people are divided up into these like categories where there's a oppressed juxtaposed next to a privileged. It's like that, but applying it to everything.
Yeah.
Like,
so even like the most banal aspects of daily life that would never otherwise be viewed through any kind of power dynamic prism, right?
Okay, so here's kind of an example. So on Tumblr, there's like a very big fandom culture, and fandom is just like, I guess, I'm sure you know, but I don't know if anyone watching knows. Like fandom is, I guess, communities of people that are devoted to a particular piece of media or a particular influencer or celebrity, and it's a fandom for that thing.
Wait, I actually don't know this. It's called fandom. Is that
fandom? Oh my gosh. Okay.
I actually see. This is I really am an old oblivious man at this point.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so fandom is.
Do I have one of those that I don't know about?
I mean, there's some account that follows me. It's like Michael Tracy Defense Squad or something. So you've got those kinds of people lurking around you, but you don't have fandom as in like they sit around making GIFs of you. They sit around making like they spend 7 hours in Photoshop making some beautifully edited picture of you in a flower crown.
I have had a couple of those actually. I have had a couple of those recently, believe it or not. I'll pull up one.
Has anyone written fan fiction about you?
I don't know. I don't think fan fiction, although who knows what goes on. I mean, I don't see all of it.
Oh, that's lovely. So yeah, you've got fan art. Okay.
That was actually pretty good, I think.
Yeah, that's pretty good. So you're like, you're fandom adjacent.
Okay.
There you go.
So I looked up fandom.
Yeah, fandom.
It's the entertainment site where fans come first.
That's not related. Like fandom is a general term.
Oh,
so I thought
you were referring to like a I thought you were referring to like some kind of social media
No,
thing.
no, it's
Okay,
a
I
general
misunderstood.
term.
Maybe I zoned out for a second. I know what I know what the word fandom means. Okay. Yeah,
Okay,
there we
good.
go.
I was about to be like, holy shit,
No,
boomer
maybe
moment.
I'm not like okay, yeah. So that was a
Okay, cool.
miscommunication.
Cool. We've
I
got
thought there was
that
like I thought
cleared
there was
up.
like some social network called fandom.
No,
Okay.
no. But fandom is very important on Tumblr. Like it's kind of like what everything revolves around, like people being in their different fandoms. And so when I say like they apply the weird intersectional social justice stuff to everything, they apply it to fandom like in a very interesting way. So there will literally be something that I remember was gay trans boys. And there's a specific word for like this community of gay trans boys. They call themselves MLM, men loving men, except they're like biologically female, but they think that they're gay men. So they will say that straight girls who ship gay pairings in whatever fandom they're in are fetishizing gay men, and that only MLM, specifically trans MLM, because they are more oppressed, so they have more right to ship gay ships, should be the only ones who are allowed to ship gay ships. And that if you're a straight girl shipping a gay ship, you need to like be called out and punished for doing that because you're fetishizing. And people will get into like these long extended, people will make entire blogs dedicated to arguing this specific issue. And they will go back and forth for weeks with hundreds of people constantly arguing over whether or not you are of the like correct privilege versus oppressed status to ship a particular ship, or if you are shipping a ship that someone has called abusive, then you need to prove that you are shipping that ship because it helps you cope with your complex trauma from being in a similar situation of abuse. But if you can't prove that you are suffering from the same kind of abuse that the person calling you out is accusing that ship of representing, then you are no longer allowed to ship that ship. And by doing that, you are actually furthering trauma in the people who've actually experienced that abuse. I know that probably made no sense, but
I was really trying to follow that. I was trying really hard, but it's difficult.
And that's like one of the most like concrete things that I can think of.
Right.
So it's just like,
so then there's stuff that's several orders of magnitude even more abstract and convoluted that it's impossible to relate.
Yeah. Or another fun one is factkin. So if you know anything about otherkin, do you know about otherkin?
I think I've heard the term, but I couldn't tell you exactly what it is.
Okay, so originally the term otherkin meant people who identify as or with animals. So like if I'm dogkin, that means that I identify as or with dogs. And so a lot of people who are blank kin, like they will actually act like that thing that they identify as. So you'll have like, if someone's like deerkin or something, they'll post their selfies in like little antlers and they'll like gallop and stuff. And it's like really stupid. And so that's the original kind of version of otherkin.
Nice galloping impression just then, by the way.
Thanks. I've been practicing. I'm deerkin myself.
Everybody enjoyed that, I'm sure.
Yes, I'm sure they did. But what got popular on Tumblr was a version of otherkin called factkin. And that meant that you identify as another real person. So like, let's say that I identify as Michael Tracy. Then I'm the real Michael Tracy.
I don't recommend that. I don't recommend that.
And the whole discourse was like, one person decides that they're the real version of blank. And then what happens when there are other people who also kin that same person? That means that you're impersonating, you're appropriating, you're trying to take away that person's identity, you're trying to erase them. And so people will get into these like super, again, long drawn out fights where they're like, their typing is reduced to like key smashes because they're sobbing so hard at the keyboard over who is the real Michael Tracy, or who is the real Naruto, or who is the real Hobbit from The Lord of the Rings. So that's another example of just like,
will the real Slim Shady please stand up?
Yeah, there you go.
Are you too young? Are you too young to know that song?
No, I'm not.
Okay,
I know about Eminem.
Okay, cool.
Um,
That's like
but yeah,
early Eminem.
well, that's just like a couple examples, and like I'm not even explaining it well is the thing. Like I'm not communicating to you like the true confusion and just utter. Like I used to identify as demonkin
You did.
because I was edgy. Like I had this whole theory, like me and some of my Tumblr friends came up with this whole theory about how like God isn't real and God is actually demons, and like it's crazy stuff. But I identified as demonkin, and my friend identified as godkin, and it sounds like a joke, but it really, really, really isn't. And I remember one time I made a joke about her being godkin, and she got really upset with me, and we like didn't talk for 2 weeks after that. So
Well, first of all, if anybody wants to identify as me, go right ahead. Have a party. And I won't be offended. I won't rage smash my keyboard either. A part of me wonders in listening to you describe this, if this stuff, whether you call it play acting or I don't know, LARPing or just using your imagination in some form, is it just a constant of human development where people in their formative years engage in these kinds of behaviors or have some kind of drive to do so, and these forums or communities or what have you just give them an outlet for it? Or is it unique, you know, to the technology? Like the technology facilitates it in some way that otherwise would, in that it otherwise wouldn't have existed, right? I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say.
I think it's both. Just because I definitely think that this kind of like play acting or however you want to describe it, like I do think that's important to like social development, and it's just kind of something that like kids and young teenagers do. Like it's just it's playful. But since these online places or online spaces, I guess, are so insulated from the outside world, and there's not really like any reality involved, it becomes like the fantasy becomes reality, and it becomes of utmost importance. Like when these people are arguing about this and they're calling each other like bigots and privileged and all this kind of stuff over like just the stupid stuff that I just mentioned, they fully believe it with their entire hearts and souls. And so I think that goes beyond just kind of playful exploration and play and socializing in a developmentally appropriate way. I think it actually becomes pretty toxic.
Yeah, and maybe now you have a prolonged adolescence for a lot of these people where they retain their playful identity stuff later into life and don't, you know, mature or grow out of it and actually now demand recognition for it as fully functioning adults who are like in the workforce or engaging in political activism and so forth. Like they've, and because your internet identity follows you more than would some, I don't know, offline identity playfulness that you engaged in 30 years ago, you know, in the same as a 14-year-old, right? I mean, you can carry it with you longer, and there's a digital trail, right? So you want a validation for that as an adult. And if you don't receive that validation, then you can claim an oppressed status. And so there's like a built-in rhetoric available to you to demand that recognition.
And it just gets like worse and worse. Like it's just going to get more and more like the stuff that I'm describing not very well. I wish I was better at describing it, but the stuff that I'm describing from Tumblr is just going to seep more and more into the culture. Like look at this person from the DNC convention, the mermaid person, the one that you mentioned earlier. Like I almost guarantee you that person identifies as a mermaid legitimately. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I doubt that person would have said that if they didn't. I mean, if you're invited to participate in some form of a political convention, I doubt you're just joking around. I mean, that it's got to be serious.
And the fact that someone like that is allowed to participate in a major political convention.
Yeah, I mean,
Like, we might joke about it, but it's only going to get worse.
yeah, I mean, they hid that during the day at some obscure session that the general public wouldn't like. They wouldn't have put that on prime time, I don't think. But they want to throw a bone to these people and make them feel welcome and engaged, and they want to profit from their political energies in some fashion. But
maybe
yeah, I
in
mean,
2024, we're going to have a actual presidential candidate that identifies as mermaid.
yeah, that would be historic.
That would be historic.
It would be history making.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Everybody's supposed to be so impressed by Kamala right now because she's of her history making potential. Or I guess she already has, quote, made history by being nominated in the first place. But yeah, I mean, there's always more history to make if you're just looking at it through an identity prism, and you have now like an endless series of identities people can adopt. So it's just going to be, people aren't going to say, okay, we made history now, that's it, over. No, they're going to keep going further and further and further into more radicalized forms of identity construction, and then imbuing that with a certain kind of political significance that enables them to make demands of others in terms of recognition or receiving a platform and so forth.
It just makes me wonder what's going to happen like 10 or 15 years down the line when a lot of the people my age who are currently involved in this crazy identity stuff, like beyond politics, who actually see themselves and their personalities and their minds and their histories and their bodies and their experiences through the lens of these crazy customizable identity complexes. At some point, I do think a lot of them are going to grow out of it. I think at some point, like, just reality is going to reckon with you. And so I wonder what that's going to mean later on when more and more people are growing out of it, and more people are looking back on the time that they spent thinking this way and seeing that it actually wasn't very helpful. It was pretty destructive.
And do you think why would they grow out of it now if they receive so much validation? I mean, if you're invited to speak at major parties, political conventions, if you get all kinds of social media plaudits, if there are, it's more and more mainstream for just reflective acceptance to be demanded of these increasingly inscrutable identity complexes. So maybe they won't grow out of it. Maybe some will and some won't. It's not going to be one or the other necessarily. But we have a climate now that I think doesn't make it obvious that necessarily someone will grow out of it or come to regret it later on. They have the societal resources available to them where they don't necessarily need to.
That's very true. And I definitely think there's going to be people who don't grow out of it, especially the people who have made careers out of it. Like, I doubt the mermaid person is going to like end up, married with kids in like a stable, healthy relationship or life. I doubt that's going to happen. But in terms of just like the slew of young people who are caught up in this, some percentage of them is going to grow out of it. Some percentage of them, like, life is just going to hit them in the face, and like actual responsibilities, actual things that matter are going to show themselves, and they're going to just mature or have a bad experience that leaves them disillusioned. And I think in a decade or two, we are going to have some group of people, I don't know the size, that are going to have negative perceptions of the time they spent having these ideas. And so something's going to have to be done about that. Like, we're going to have to confront that at some point.
Yeah. And you wonder also if it will bring about a more robust and organized, conservative counter-reaction, right? Mm-hmm. You see sort of the makings of that now in terms of how the quote unquote SJW culture is sort of a mirror image in a way of like the quote unquote alt-right. These terms almost feel irrelevant or obsolete now, but that's sort of, that was the Angela Nagel thesis. I don't know if you read that book that I recommended, but she put that out there. Yeah. Okay. You'll get around to it eventually.
Yeah, I will.
Um, but as these sort of like identity categories grow and get more and more complex, then they're going to be, should, if the regret ever happens or if the reevaluation ever happens, there's going to be more and more opportunity for conservative reaction potentially from a variety of different angles.
Yeah.
And
I think even if there's not a lot of people who have a similar experience to me, I think there will be enough, and especially like, I guess, people who are, something I've noticed, and some of the people who become the most fanatical in this kind of thing is that some of the ones who are the most fanatical are only that way for a relatively short amount of time, like 2 to 3 years at most, and then they eventually become disillusioned and kind of have a similar experience to me where they like branch out into everything else. But there's something about this way of interpreting identity that really appeals to, and I don't know if the same can be said for other ideologies, this is just the one that I've experienced in, but there's something that draws very intelligent, very creative, very driven people into it. I know, like, personally for me, a lot of the detransition friends, like I have a good handful of detransition friends who I would openly say that they are above average in terms of creativity and intelligence. So there's going to be those people who they become extremely devoted, extremely fanatical. They pour all of that energy and creativity and intellect into the ideology. And at some point, something happens that just triggers a break, or over time they become disillusioned. I think those people are going to be some of the most useful voices in the like conservative, if you want to call it that, but whatever the opposition to this is. Even if there aren't large numbers, there's going to be those few exceptional people that they have a life-changing experience one way or another, and they're going to be a really big part of the movement against it.
Yeah, and when I say conservative, I don't necessarily mean like having a fidelity to Donald Trump or the Republican Party or something, or conservative ideology, but like we mentioned earlier with sort of the religious thing, like having a distance or a remove from a societal dynamic that you can then describe to others, maybe recognize the pitfalls in it or the potentials for harm, and maybe conservative is even a misnomer for that, because it doesn't necessarily entail you to adopt any conservative political beliefs. So
I guess conservative compared to this.
Yeah, conservative, very relatively speaking, like you're all the way out on the spectrum, and then like you're a few degrees back toward the center, and yet you're somehow conservative still. No, I mean that's sort of defining down conservatism. I think the actual Catholic like reactionaries would be offended.
Yeah, they will be.
All right. Anything that we didn't touch on that you feel is relevant on this or any other topic? Anything that's on your mind? Or should we just trail off here and conclude? I didn't really have a firm agenda for this conversation, as you can tell. It was off the cuff.
Yeah, I obviously didn't either, because you asked me like 20 minutes before we did this. But,
I know. It's just like, hey, let's just I have nothing to do right now.
Let's just vibe.
Yeah, let's just vibe.
Chill. We're just vibing.
We are vibing.
I don't know. Like, what did you like? Because you've been traveling so much recently in recent weeks, and like you've just been seeing so much crazy stuff, and you've been to a lot of these protests, right? Like that's been the majority of what you've been doing, like scoping out the protests.
Not so much the protests after June or July or around there. I mean, the protests have. I mean, there was that initial burst of protest activity in the first couple of weeks, so I was at a lot of that. But the purpose of the trip was really to mostly see the aftermath of the riots. Although Portland was a different story; it's sort of its own animal, where you do have ongoing nightly protests. So that was when I was at that actual protest thing. That was the first bona fide protest I had been to in, I don't know, maybe a month or so. But then there's also sort of riot aftermath in Portland where stuff's getting smashed up that doesn't really get talked about. Did you have a question there, or were you just prompting me to vibe?
I was gonna ask, like, since you have been to a lot of these protests, and we touched on this a little bit last time, where you were asking kind of like, why is Black Lives Matter and trans lives matter? I guess whatever. Why are they so enmeshed right now? Did you see any more enmeshing while you were out on your trip, whether to the protest or like something in the aftermath? Like, did you see anything that added to either your information pool on this or that gave you some additional thoughts on that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, when we spoke, I think after we spoke, the only major protest that I went to was Portland. I think I might have mentioned in our last talk having been to Chicago on Juneteenth, where there was a big Black Lives Matter protest / demonstration, and this is the middle of Chicago on Juneteenth, which is like an African American holiday commemorating the liberation from slavery, and it's like all white people, not all, but many, like a disproportionate share of white people waving around Black trans lives signs.
Yeah.
So it fused together almost seamlessly. I mean, because it's not immediately apparent why trans should have anything to do with Black Lives Matter. I mean, that assumption was just made without anybody having to justify it. And, you can get into the whole intersectional explanation for why that makes such intuitive sense to so many people. But like most normal people, you have to kind of explain it, you think?
Yeah.
It just doesn't get explained. It just gets claimed, or it just gets, it's just sort of an assumption that is believed to be widely shared reflexively. But in Portland, you go and anytime you go to any protest associated with this, I found you're guaranteed to have people waving Black trans lives stuff. It's just a guarantee. There's no question about it.
It's like that here too. Just like Black trans lives all over the place. Like there's the rainbow flag that now has the
Where are you now?
Chicago still.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I'm moving next month. I'm super excited. I've been like talking about it on Twitter a lot. So I'm really excited about that. Can't wait. Because of what I was just describing, like it's like Chicago is Twitter in real life. Like as this stuff develops and gets more like convoluted and radical, like that is reflected in the neighborhood that I live in. Kind of going off of what you said with a lot of these protesters, especially on like Juneteenth, you would think that there would be in Chicago a lot of Black people assembling, but that it was mostly white. A very similar thing happened. So right down the street from me, the police blocked off an entire section of road for them to paint a Black Lives Matter mural on the road. And it just blows my mind that they think like they're oppressed when it's like the police are breaking it off so that people can't drive and people can't walk, so that you can paint on the road. Like the police are breaking it off for you. How are you oppressed? But
in other words, the state is facilitating your activism.
Yes,
like they're giving you official governmental license to do what it is that you want to do. So
what on God's green earth these people are like, what is their excuse for that? I'm not sure. But so I like pulled up next to the road where this was happening, and I was like, what are all these people gathered for? And I like looked over and I saw that they were painting Black Lives Matter, and I'm pretty sure one of the letters is even a trans flag. Like it has the colors of the trans flag.
Is there a trans flag that's different from just the regular LGBT flag?
Yes, blue, pink, white, pink, blue.
Okay, more evidence of oblivious old man than here.
More boomerism. Jesus, no, yeah. Google the trans flag. You'll recognize those colors. I recognize those. I need
to do the work.
Yeah, you need to do the work. You need to educate yourself. But I looked over at the people who were painting, and it's all like young couples with kids that are white, like young white couples with kids painting this Black Lives Matter that the police have roped off for them to be able to do so. And it's like, that's so interesting. It's literally like a bunch of kids, white kids, painting with their dads while their moms stand off in the corner and talk. And that's supposed to be like revolutionary activism, right next to posters calling for violent communist revolution. It's so crazy.
I know, right? Yeah, that's like
it's so crazy.
Okay, so there's the trans flag that
yes, that's the trans flag.
I honestly had never seen before. I mean, people think I'm obsessed with trans. No, it's just like.
But you never even saw the flag.
I know. I just was not immersed in this until it came onto the agenda so forcefully. People, I'm trying to be honest as possible about that, but now, like, I see theories about how I just lay awake. I've like for years and years and years, I've laid awake at night, fuming about trans people or something. Just no.
Do they say that you do it because you're secretly attracted to trans women? I
have heard that. Yeah, I have heard that.
That's a common one.
Yeah. No comment. But yeah, I mean, what you just said there is, I mean, that's a microcosm of a dynamic that is really interesting that hasn't been engaged with much vis-a-vis this protest movement, which is that you have this confluence of normies, right? It's normies who, for whom Black Lives Matter is just the baseline of what you would expect them to be committed to politically, even though they, as we mentioned before, don't really necessarily see it in political terms. But then it's sort of fused together with like revolutionary communists, right? Or in the case of Portland, anarchists, who aren't shy about telling you what their ideological prescriptions are. I mean, they're calling for overthrow of the state. And yet you have normie Dems saying, oh, it's just these benign Black Lives Matter moms and veterans. And I actually had a column about this week for the Wall Street Journal. But like people aren't interested in actually examining on good faith, like the ideological predilections of the people that they're elevating and defending. Shouldn't you at least be curious? I mean, you could go there yourself and talk to them. I did. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's not like this incredible feat of investigative journalism or something. It's just common sense.
Or at least like stop to think about it. Because after the riots started happening, like I have pictures of them on my phone, but it's so funny. Do you know the meme that leftists, they can't meme because they type paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs? Do you know that meme?
Vaguely. I've heard like leftists can't meme said by like right wing meme experts. Like they say that leftists are bad at memes.
Well, they are. But commonly associated with that meme, it's like just screenshots of leftists typing paragraphs and paragraphs. Yeah. But anyway, that's besides the point. There are these posters
walls of text.
Yes, walls of text. There are these posters up in my neighborhood, and like I live in Andersonville, so it's very affluent. Except for like people who live in shitty studio apartments like me. But other than that, very affluent, lots of like couples with kids, like old rich gay couples mostly, lots and lots of kids. Like there's a elementary school 2 blocks down the street from these posters that I'm about to describe. But there are these posters hanging up in Andersonville where it's like 24 inches tall, and it's like tiny text, and it's just going on and on and on and on and on and on and on, calling for violent communist revolution, saying that we need to burn things down. We need to burn down the whole system, that like violence is not violence if it's fighting injustice, like all this kind of stuff. And there's like even this one that gives like basically a Cliff Notes version of the 1619 Project, where it's like talking about like how all of American history is a lie and all this stuff, next to calling for violent communist revolution. And it just makes me wonder how these like white moms who take their kids to paint the Black Lives Matter mural, like how do they walk past those posters? And I mean, I'm sure they've stopped to read at least a little bit of it. Like they're freaking huge, and they're like covering this entire wall that you walk past it. It's like 15 feet of walking the whole time. You're going to be walking past the same 2 posters right next to each other. It just makes me wonder, like, do they not connect that with what they're doing? Or do they think that their version of Black Lives Matter is completely different from this crazy people version of Black Lives Matter? Or do they think that, on some level, those people are virtuous and justified and that it's okay to call for violent revolution? I just don't know how to square away being a mom taking your kid to paint Black Lives Matter 2 blocks down from these crazy posters and knowing what kind of crazy rhetoric is going on. Like, it's hung up in your neighborhood.
Yeah, I don't think they're even thinking about it that deeply, frankly.
Really?
There have always been, I don't know. I mean, do you think the moms are even like cognizant of the spectrum of ideology that's operative within Black Lives Matter? Do they really think about things on that level? I'm not sure. I mean, there have always been like revolutionary communists who latch on to protest movements, but you go to New York City at any protest and they're there. I mean, they're like literally revolutionary communists. But the Bob Avakian followers, hilariously, Bob Avakian,
that guy.
Hilariously, he endorsed Biden because as like a united front thing against Trump, who's a fascist, blah blah blah.
Amazing. That's just
yeah. What was I going to say?
Bob Avakian.
Yeah,
followers.
So like in Portland, they try to make it out to seem as though that they're simply moms and veterans, because if you actually look at the operational core of the protest movement in Portland in particular, you would come to understand that it's driven. I mean, the reason why they have nightly protests is because the revolutionary anarchists or the insurrectionist anarchists desire a constant violent confrontation with the state. I mean, but they don't try to hide it.
Yeah.
That's, if it was just moms and veterans, it wouldn't be going on every single night for almost 3 months now. And there's a specific political agenda behind it. But if that were to be brought to the forefront, clearly it would promote a certain type of radicalism that probably wouldn't be too appealing to most normies. So it's like a conscious PR thing on their part. And so, I wonder if, but then again, while there always have been these Bob Avakian types running around, you have to wonder if there's now an atmosphere where their insurrectionist or revolutionary attitudes genuinely are more mainstream. So they're not just fringe cranks anymore.
Yeah.
One of my working theories is that the riots in Minneapolis were initially instigated, at least in large part, by actual revolutionary insurrectionists.
I gotta send you a video. There's this video that someone sent me. It's like an investigation into, I guess, some different like radical revolutionary communist groups. And there's actually videos of Zoom calls where they're planning basically a lot of these riots. I don't know how much of the riots were specifically due to these groups, and I forget the name of the main group.
I think I probably have seen this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean,
it's the environmentalist group.
Yeah, I saw that. That's not.
Yeah.
You
already been new.
I don't think that these people are organized on Zoom. I mean, I think they have other communications networks.
Well, definitely, but there was videos of people on Zoom, and they were like talking about their plans.
Yeah, that's like Sunrise Movement, which is sort of a more, it's like half normie, half radical, which is like an interesting fusion in its own right that I think is stems from the way in which this protest movement has come about. Even to have it so wholly embraced by somebody like Joe Biden, who's talking about George Floyd in his nomination speech that will go down, when people talk about Joe Biden in history, that's going to be one of the top speeches that they reference in his entire career. He's been around since literally 1973 or 71 in terms of the federal government. Um,
God damn.
I think it was 73 when he was first elected to the Senate as a 29-year-old. Crazily enough,
Wow.
I would never vote for a 29-year-old Senate candidate now.
That's dumb.
Yeah,
How that turns out.
yeah. I mean, AOC is a headache enough. So
Yeah, I know.
and she's only like
Biden's a headache too. For real.
Yeah, but not he's not as annoying as AOC. Anyway, but yeah, it's just these ascertaining whether these whether this radical ideology, like the kind that you reference on the wall of text poster or whatever, genuinely is more mainstream or is it still fringe, or it's like it's at least a worthy topic of inquiry. I've tried to contribute something to that line of inquiry, but it seems like people just aren't interested. I mean, they don't want to evaluate. They don't want to apply the evaluative standards that they would to any other kind of protest movement to this. Like, imagine if this was a right-wing movement. I mean, we'd have reams of investigative materials into their origins, into who they are, what they're about, what they're demanding, etc. A lot of it would be critical. There'd be some at least adversarial element to it, so it's not just promoting their PR constantly, but
there's not really any talk about left-wing radicalization at all. Like, that's not really seen as something that can happen.
Well, I mean, I don't know, especially there isn't now, because it could be seen as helping Trump. Like, if you say that Antifa, even if you say that Antifa exists as some kind of operational force, that's helping Trump because you're validating one of his talking points or something. And yeah, just do certain right-wing pundits mischaracterize what Antifa is? Sure. But it doesn't mean it's not real in some way and therefore merits interrogation, right? Yeah. But there's just such a lack of interest. It's almost incredible, at least the level of interest in actually investigating the true nature of some of these driving forces behind the movement is not congruous with the historic significance that's been attributed to them. And the New York Times gleefully reported last month that this is the largest protest movement ever in terms of the number of people who went out. I was going to say, here's one thing that I was going to bring up. In the early days of the protest, when there was still daily protests, I went to a suburban protest. So I wanted to get the broadest range of geographies in terms of where protest action was happening. And there was this was in Robbinsville, New Jersey. So it's right outside Trenton. It's an upscale suburb where you have a Republican mayor, actually, who coordinated with faith leaders to have a day of reflection or some kind of civic holiday almost, or civic event anyway, that was sanctioned by the municipal government, technically in violation of the pandemic regulations that were in effect at the time, but that's a whole other story. And it was moderate compared to other left-wing protests that have happened, no doubt about it. It was mainstream religious leaders, Christians, Jews, Sikhs, I believe Muslims, etc. Talking about Black Lives Matter, but talking about it from a relatively moderate standpoint. And then you go and say, okay, here's some materials we're passing. Here's materials for further, I think it's further resources. So they have a printout that you go and people went and took. And I went to go and get the printout, and it's 1619 Project. It's Ibram Kendi. It's White Fragility. I think that was actually the first time I had heard of the book White Fragility, when it was listed as the recommended reading on this suburban, utterly mainstream soccer mom thing that was held with a Republican mayor participating. And I could go back and it was like the epitome of anti-racism ideology with a fair amount of radicalism thrown in there. So it gets, which is all to say that a lot of the radical ideology gets insinuated into mainstream discourse under the cover of what seems like non-controversial topics such as Black Lives Matter. Even just think of the term Black Lives Matter. You can't say that you're against it. I mean, who could say that Black lives don't matter, right? I mean, it's the most anodyne phrase ever in one way, but obviously it also takes on all these additional political meanings, some of which are extremely radical. But if you talk about it, even if you say Black Lives Matter has radical components, that's seen as right wing, right? Or even if you're trying to just be straightforwardly analytical about it. I mean, a lot of what they're proposing is, how could it not be radical? I mean, they're calling for a radical restructuring of society.
Did you?
If you're in Portland and you're calling for the abolition of the modern state under the aegis of Black Lives Matter, yeah, I would say it's a touch radical. And look, if something is radical, it doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong, but it's radical. I mean, it's descriptively accurate to say that it's radical.
Yeah. Did you see those leaked Black Lives Matter curriculum materials out of New York public schools?
I don't think so. I'm trying to plug in my laptop here.
That I must send to you because it is truly crazy. It's like kind of like you said, like they're laundering extremely, extremely radical ideas under like a seemingly innocuous cover. And it's like all of these lessons, and especially the ones for the super young kids. So there's lesson outlines and there's materials for like pre-K type of students, so very, very young. And it's all this stuff where on the surface, it looks like it's like about, everyone is different. People are different. And that's called diversity. But like the more you go into the materials, the crazier and crazier it gets, to the point where they're actually openly teaching tiny, tiny children about how America is white supremacist and oppressive, and they need to overthrow it, and we need to dismantle the system that is America. So,
yeah, I think I've seen something like this.
I'll try to find it and send it to you because it's messed up.
Even now, there are people. There's this one guy. I think his last name is Rufo. I think it's Christopher Rufo, if I'm not mistaken.
Him, yeah.
Who FOIAs? I mean, he actually is doing journalism, where he's FOIA-ing, filing freedom of information requests for mostly Seattle, I think. But he's also done the federal government, if I'm not mistaken, where they have these training materials that state employees are required to participate in terms of diversity and whatnot, where sometimes they're like literally racially segregated, meaning that there's separate training for whites and non-whites. And, the ideology being imparted at these trainings is, maybe they don't think of it as radical, but like if you had described it like 5 years ago, it would have been everybody would have recognized it was radical, including liberals and leftists and such,
Yes.
And maybe they would have agreed with it on some level, but they would have at least acknowledged its radicalism. But now it's, the Overton window has shifted such that it's not even perceived as radical anymore, which is, to their credit strategically. I mean, those who are pushing this ideology have done a great job, in terms of achieving their goals. You got to give them credit. I mean, even I wrote a piece a while ago on Portland where I said that, you got to hand it to the anarchists. I mean, they've done a great job tactically. People aren't even analyzing their views. And yet, but they've achieved mainstream legitimation in a way that they hadn't. I mean, I think that this protest movement is the most successful triumph. Is like the biggest triumph for anarchists, maybe since they assassinated William McKinley.
And there's something, I don't know how much was intentional or how much was just like the way that, the chips fell, but there's something incredible about the way that they've basically managed to almost sneak behind enemy territory and kind of disable the people who would be their opposition, to the point where even conservatives, like quote unquote conservatives, are feeling compelled to argue from within the parameters that this ideology sets for them. Like there's not really, outside of the kind of like whatever the sphere that I guess we are in, with people who are very openly and very expertly critiquing the wokeness, there's not like a general opposition. Like you would think that the conservatives would have some kind of stronger opposition to what's going on, but it's like every step of the way they've kind of just like laid down and let it happen. Like they'll object a little bit, or they'll call like Democrats or leftists hypocritical, or they'll say like, oh, Joe Biden's the real racist, or oh, Susan B. Anthony's the real racist. But like they're still arguing from within those parameters, and there's just something about the way that this has been carried out that has disabled any opposition before it's even gotten a chance to look around and see what's happening. And I don't know how much that is the fault of the conservatives for not paying attention to these cultural issues and focusing on economics and foreign policy, but there's something very interesting about that to me.
I mean, there are definitely conservatives who are very much focused on culture, but I think a lot of them
I think
a lot of them have almost retreated. Like they almost have accepted that they've lost, in terms of culture war. So they don't have a countervailing ideological answer to it, and therefore just kind of play on the playing field that's set out by the radicals. I mean, that's nothing new. I mean, that's sort of how it's worked throughout history. I'm sure there was a parallel from the 60s that we probably could come up with in terms of how they talked about family structures back then, or whatever, parental authority, the prevailing views that were being challenged then. But this seems different to me. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
In the 60s, there was a stifling. I mean, I don't know. There was some societal assumptions that were rightly challenged during that time. Maybe there were excesses. There definitely were, in fact, excesses. But now it's like there's I don't know, more of a self-indulgence here that's hard to pin down exactly. But even Trump, when the George Floyd stuff was breaking out, he didn't really take an oppositional attitude to it. He was saying, "Oh, this is horrible."
Even
He
Trump.
proposed. He signed some kind of executive order. I don't know how much teeth it had, but he did some executive order on police reform. So he accepted some of the premises.
Which that it's so strange to me, because you would think that Trump would be the last person to do something like that. And I don't know like what his strategy is or whatever, but that was very strange to me. And just like the biggest thing for me is like, okay, yeah, we could probably find something comparable in the 60s, but what's going on right now, there are so many places where it would be easy for conservatives to just latch onto something and drive it home and build a very compelling case as to why they're correct and the woke people, or whatever you want to call them, are wrong. And I think probably the best example of that is the trans stuff, because there's just something about what's going on with the trans community and a lot of the behavior and the outward perception of a lot of people involved, where it's like you can intuitively tell that this is not the happy, authentic, joyous thing that the trans community makes it all out to be. Like you can kind of intuitively tell that transitioning 5-year-olds is wrong. You can kind of intuitively tell that cutting breasts off of 13-year-old girls is wrong. And the fact that conservatives aren't, like, there definitely are, like there was James Younger, that was a big thing. Like everyone rightfully lost their minds over that for a while. But just like there's so much material here in the trans issue that it doesn't take a genius to point it out and play to people's natural feelings of, wanting to protect children, or just like the natural feelings of almost revulsion at kind of at least for me, when I look at a lot of the trans stuff, I see something very cynical, something very dark, something very negative. And maybe that's just because of my own experiences. But I think like on the outside, just objectively, there's something very dark and negative about, I guess, thousands and thousands of people going to get body parts chopped off. And just like it's celebrated. Like there's just something about that it would be so easy to latch onto that and to play a similar emotional game that the left is playing. Where like the left is like getting all of these people stirred up with their anger and their indignation. Like you could get a similar sort of feeling in the opposite direction. It's just not being done. And I don't know why. I don't know why nobody's
it's not
taking
like
that opportunity.
It's not because it wouldn't be like an affirmative thing. It would be a reactionary thing. I mean, that's why the term reactionary exists. Like you're reacting to societal forces that are changing the longstanding structures in terms of how we order ourselves. And so it's not like it's not easily translatable into an overarching worldview in the way that the forces of societal change have, whether you call it woke ideology or something else. And I think you do see some, right-wing people playing on the instinctual, the revulsion that certain people feel when they see the more outlandish examples of this stuff. But converting it into a overarching political program, it's kind of not quite in the nature of conservative reaction in the way that the people who are kind of fashioning a new ideology operate, But I guess we'll see maybe how they organize this Republican convention next week, and if there's anything that draws on these themes. I'm sure there will be to some form.
We'll
I mean, you can bet that they're going to talk about the riots a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I got cited in a Senate hearing by a Republican senator just because, like, and if they're citing me, they're desperate for material. So, all right. It's almost midnight here, and my my computer charger is tied up on my chair, and I can't plug it into my computer at the moment, embarrassingly. So my computer's at 3% battery.
Oh no! All right, you should probably go charge your shit.
And I think it's a natural time to wind down anyway. So
yeah, for sure.
All right, so this was, I think, worthwhile. This is a useful vibe session.
Glad I could vibe. Sorry, I'm a little like tired and discombobulated today, but we had fun.
You don't strike me as discombobulated. Don't sell yourself short. But discombobulating can sort of be endearing in its own right.
I hope it was.
All right, I'll talk to you later.
All right, bye-bye. Have a good night.